Welcome to the War in Heaven. I am Austin Hepworth, here along with Michael Hepworth, and we are talking about how the war in heaven still continues on the earth today. And we like to go through, talk about what was at stake in the war in heaven, and also talk about how it's reflected here in what we experience in life. Today, we wanted to talk more in depth. Last time we talked about creation and how there's something created, and to have something that exists, there has to be something that's not that. So if I have my hand, then I have something that's not my hand. But from the scriptures that we read, there's a passage that I will share here that talks about kind of this opposition scenario where you have something that exists or something that doesn't, or as it's called here, there's an opposition in all things. And this is one of the key principles to understand God, to understand life, darkness, evil, good, all these different things that are at play in the war in heaven. So this comes from 2nd Nephi, which is a book in the Book of Mormon. And it starts with, we're starting in verse 10, kind of in the middle of it. It says, "Wherefore the ends of the law which the Holy One hath given, unto the inflicting of the punishment which is affixed, which punishment that is affixed is in opposition to that of the happiness which is affixed, to answer the ends of the atonement." So we're taught specifically there's happiness, and then there's something that's not happiness, or this punishment. And it talks about this opposition being affixed according to this law. Verse 11, "For it must needs be that there is an opposition in all things. If not so, righteousness could not be brought to pass, neither wickedness, neither holiness nor misery, neither good nor bad. Wherefore all things must needs be a compound in one." And then it says also, "Wherefore if it should be one body, it must needs remain as dead, having no life, neither death, nor corruption, nor incorruption, happiness, nor misery, neither sense, nor insensibility. Wherefore it must needs have been created for a thing of naught. Wherefore there would have been no purpose in the end of its creation. Wherefore this thing must needs destroy the wisdom of God and his eternal purposes, and also the power and the mercy and the justice of God. And if you shall say there is no law, ye shall also say there is no sin. And if you shall say there is no sin, ye shall also say there is no righteousness. And if there be no righteousness, there be no happiness. And if there be no righteousness nor happiness, there be no punishment nor misery. And if these things are not, there is no God. And if there is no God, we are not, neither the earth, for there could have been no creation of things, neither to act nor to be acted upon. Wherefore all things must have vanished away. So in this passage, we want to, this harkens back a little bit to the last podcast here, but it says, "Wherefore all things must needs be a compound in one." This is talking about if there's no opposition, if there's nothing that's opposite the thing that exists. And then it specifically says it must needs remain as dead. So one of the points that we want to talk about today is law and its role in bringing life to us, to the universe, to existence. And law is an integral part of agency. I believe very strongly that agency, life, law, these concepts are very, very closely tied together. You take away one, you take away the others. And so if we go to the concept of law, to look at why do we have to have law? If there is no law, then I've always kind of imagined it as just everything's free floating in space. Space is the closest mental image I can have to a state of no law, where things are just floating. But even more so than in space, we see stars, we see planets. If there was no law of gravity, there wouldn't even be planets. Everything, every little atom would just be floating. Or, like this talks about, it would just be one. There'd be one body, it says. It just needs to be as if there's one body. There'd be no separation of anything. When creation happens and there's a hand created, then there's a law that says something doesn't cross, a boundary is created. You could view law also as a boundary. If you take something, you divide it, and now you've created a boundary. You have this half and this half. And now those two things can exist. if you also create something that's not them. And so this notion of law makes it so that things have boundaries. And again, boundaries are an essential prerequisite to life itself. You have to have a boundary in order for there to be life, because I have to be separate from something that's not alive. And so we have things to act and things to be acted upon. It's one of the things that the scripture talks about, is that when we have creation and something's given life, life only has meaning if there's agency, there's the ability to act. And you can only have the ability to act if there's something to act upon. And these things, these principles, they may sound, sometimes it sounds a little bit, well, yeah, of course, or some people just gloss over them, but I think it really is critical to dive deep to understand that, fundamentally speaking, when we talk about life and we talk about law, even here on the earth. So I'm an attorney, I'm running for political office, so I'm involved in politics, involved in legal matters, involved in lawsuits, different things. Law gives life. Now, certainly too much law can take life away. If it becomes all law for everything, there's no choice left. That can destroy life. But law, when properly balanced and put in its proper sphere, helps to bring life. And things like the US Constitution were a foundational set of laws that brought life to a country. And as people were allowed to apply those in their life, and the government had restrictions and rules and different things to follow, America became alive. And it's fascinating to look at the sheer amount of life brought by the Constitution itself. When the closer we got to striking this balance to where law should be, the more prosperous and advanced America became, to the point where technology has just skyrocketed in this version of a legal system that I feel very strongly tries to strike this balance to agency. But Michael, definitely want to let you chime in for a few minutes on these notions of opposition law, some of the basic things that we're reading here in 2nd Nephi.
Yeah, when I think of law, another thing you can consider is it gives a defined outcome to action. One of the implicit assumptions in science is that the world, the universe, everything around us is intelligible. We can understand it. Science assumes that there is law or laws that govern everything that you see, what we experience. And that is saying that it assumes that there's a defined outcome for every action, for an example, and that we can discover them and understand them. And so law gives that order to life. It gives that predictability, in a sense, so that today when you throw a ball, it behaves in a certain way. You can gain a skill at throwing the ball. You can understand how your muscles and the ball and the air resistance and gravity all interact, and you can get very good at throwing a ball because it's consistent. It interacts the same way every time. If there was no law, if it was just today it behaves this way and tomorrow it behaves another way, there's no point, there's no meaning to ever trying to learn to throw a ball. Today you'll get good at it, and tomorrow you'll fly off the earth because gravity will change. So that it's kind of a technical description, but law gives us that predictable outcome. If we do this, this will happen. If we do this, this will happen. It's just predictable, makes life predictable, and because it's predictable, it's meaningful. We can understand what actions we can take to get what outcomes we desire, what we don't desire. And sometimes we wish we could take a certain action and get a outcome that is in opposition to a law. But the point of law is that the outcome is always predictable. And so if you could just change the outcome to be whatever you want, it ceases to become predictable. It ceases to become a law at that point. So kind of what this is talking about when it goes through and says, if there's no law, then there's no sin. If there's nothing that says you can't do this, then there's nothing bad to do at that point. You would continue down to there being no righteousness and no happiness. There's no predictable outcome. Part of our enjoyment in life and our understanding and our meaning is being able to work towards something, understand it, and become. Becoming is a big part of what we feel is important in this life. Regardless of what our belief is, most people believe that becoming is a very important aspect. And there's no becoming if there's no law. There's nothing, we can't call anything good or bad if there's no dividing line, as you discussed. If there's nothing that's not good, then there can't be good. So there has to be a good and a bad, and that's all based on the fact that law exists.
I love some of those points. Specifically thinking about this this notion of the predictable outcome in science, because science, if you think about its assumption, and there's a lot of people that really strongly believe science, it's working to understand the laws. It's trying to find a set of rules or laws that govern all interactions to make it so we can predict. Now, why do we want to predict what will happen? So that we can then make a choice to say, well, if I know that if I put this compound with this and put it in this container, I can blast it off to the moon. That's what science is trying to do. They want to be able to predict, to achieve something. And one of the strongest underlying rationale for the fact that there is a law or a cohesive set of rules that applies even in nature and science is the fact that we're alive. And law and life go directly together, because if it were just that, one day all the elements organized like this and the next day they organized like this and it was just completely random, there'd be nothing for us to pattern in existence after. But the fact that we can live and we can even have engineering and put up a bridge and it stays up, it's proof that there's something predictable. And the only way to have something predictable is if there's a law or a set of conditions that are always being followed consistently. And so science, it's fascinating to me because a lot of people say, I don't believe in God, I believe in science. And I've always been curious about that, because I say, well, science is aggressively looking to determine what laws exist, what rules exist. And science has no ability to answer the question of, well, who's the lawgiver? Where'd the law come from? How does the law just be enforced if there's no lawgiver? And what's the mechanism that makes it so that gravity always works consistently? We can program satellites to go fly and spin off gravity and do these different things. What's the mechanism that makes that so consistent? And to me, when we start to look at the fact that there is consistency, that there is a predictable outcome, that can make some people upset, because they can say, well, I want to eat my cake and be healthy, for example. I want to consume all types of junk food and be healthy. But the laws in place say, you're going to, over time, that's going to hurt your body with certain foods that go in there, or certain things that go in it. If you want to fly, you can't just jump off things. You can't just fly. Gravity has an impact. It has a role, and it operates on us all the time. Now, this then leaves us with, the law then leaves us with the choice. If I want to function today and achieve something, I work in accordance with gravity, not against it. I don't go jump off a cliff or a building. And so this predictable outcome does allow me then to have a choice. And the fact that I have a choice means I can exercise one of the conditions of life. And to me, when we talk about, it's this fascinating thing about life, because life itself has an element of unpredictability to it. The laws create a situation where then I can choose, but there's no law that says what ultimately I will choose. I'm this kind of wild card factor. And so life becomes this wild card factor in all of existence. It can take in all this. It can say, okay, there's gravity, there's chemicals, there's elements, there's all these different things that interact. And I'm going to make a choice about what I do to those. Do I pick up a rock and throw it? Do I build a house? What do I do with that rock? But that wild card part, or the agency part, is made possible by the fact that there was law that existed to create a situation where I had choice. Once I had choice, the law doesn't stop me from making the choices, but it will impose consequences for my actions. And in the war in heaven, we believe very strongly that Satan he had a war against agency. He didn't like this notion of the wild card or of life itself. He was fighting against that. And he wanted to remove agency. But the removal of agency, Satan's plan, we're taught, produced death, the spiritual death. And I don't think we appreciate enough that when you remove agency from existence, you're removing one of the elements of life itself. Life is a wild card in a sense. And if you want to make sure everyone does what's right all the time, then there is no wild card. It's imposing a law on everything. And if there's a law over everything and there's no choice left, then we're taught that there is no life. And all things are just as one. We're losing boundaries at this point. And one of the ways I like to look at it is with a robot. We have robots that do amazing things, cars that drive themselves. Now, would we call the car alive? And even AI is, in a sense, making some of its own decisions. It will choose to do certain things, learn certain things. But to be human is to truly be able to make a choice without being subject to a complete set of programming. And a robot is always subject to programming. And if a robot walked up to me and gave me a hug and said, "I love you, Austin," it would feel very different to me than if my child or a friend chose to give me a hug and say, "I love you, Austin." Because a robot is acting according to programming. It's being told what to do. Whereas love is meaningful and life is meaningful and happiness comes because we make a decision. We choose to abide by certain conditions to achieve a certain result. And so when that ability to choose is taken away, happiness is taken away because I'm not choosing anymore. It just is. There's nothing to choose between. There's no reward. There's no punishment. And this is why the scriptures talk about this concept of no happiness, no misery, no punishment. And it's interesting to me that in our society today, when I look at how the war in heaven's playing out right now in our political sphere, as an attorney, candidate for office, a significant number of people from either side of the political spectrum, whether they're Democrat, Republican, something else, conservative, liberal, wherever they fall, they turn to the government to solve problems. Both sides say that should be illegal when something bad happens. And we want the law to punish and the law to do all these things. But I look at that and I say, well, if we demand the law come in and dictate everything, we are asking for a state of no liberty. And we're asking for a state of no liberty. We're literally reducing the amount of life that we can experience when all those choices are made for us. And more and more and more, the law makes choices for us, tells us what to do, and it tells us what we can't do. And the amount of law we're pumping out right now in America is incredible. We're trying to fix every problem. Something bad happened. The product was defective. It hurt somebody. Well, let's make a law against it. We have, assassination attempt, different things that happen. Well, We need to make more laws. Guns are already illegal, but let's make it more illegal. And every time that we try to solve a problem through law, we have to, I believe, I always look at to say, is the law necessary to create the state of agency? Or are we now delving into the realm of life itself, the realm where there is risk, there is chance for things to happen, but we have to be okay with that, because that's what brings life. That's what brings prosperity, is when people get to choose for themselves what they do or don't do. And so to me, one of the major balances to try and strike is the same that God or nature has struck. There's a lot of laws in nature, and they're harsh. Gravity is a harsh law. It's not merciful. It's not kind at all. If I jump off a cliff, it hurts, or I die. And that's just the way it is. And so these are things that laws are there, consequences are there, but that gives me a choice that allows me to choose to act, to be, and to do. Michael, do you have more thoughts on those principles?
Yeah, I think another way to look at it is, at least from a human perspective, where is the law being imposed, and what is the law being imposed? Law should govern everything, but that doesn't mean that the law-giving body for the humans needs to be the federal government in every case, every time. To your point, that starts to reduce agency to a point where life is reduced. So the question becomes, what law is applied from a federal level? What law is applied from a state level? What law is applied from an individual level? As individuals, what laws should we take on ourselves and apply to ourselves? We usually, when I talk about the laws that the individual should live by, it's the more general laws of kindness and charity and self-sufficiency or responsibility, different things like that, that when they get to a certain excess, we can talk about what role a government may play. But if we don't become a lawgiver to ourselves, then we're seceding that choice, that agency, to the state, to the federal government, and we're losing life at that point. And so to maintain our liberty, our livelihood, it requires the imposition of law at an individual level by ourselves. We have to submit ourselves to our own laws. And in the past, these have been societal norms, these have been morality, these have been societal mores. Lots of different words have been used for them. But things that we do as individuals, so that they're restrictions we put on ourselves so that we can continue to maintain our own agency, our own liberty. If we abandon our societal values in the way we treat each other and the way we behave, and there's still a desire for functioning society, those are all just given to a government, an entity above all of us. And the only recourse they have is force, which is the reduction of our liberty. If we want to retain our liberty, we have to live by certain standards so that we can interact with each other in a peaceful way without having to go to the government to solve every one of our problems. So, I guess to sum it up, when we talk about laws that are imposed on everything, that doesn't mean that in the case of human interaction, if something needs to happen, then it must be a law imposed by a state or a federal government. I would argue that most of the things that need to happen are impositions we need to put on ourselves and in our interaction with other people. And there's a level that at a communal level, we can look to a federal government in certain instances. We can look to a state government. We can look to a city government. But by and large, to retain our own liberty, we need to retain our own moral values that we impose on ourselves. And that's the way to maintain the most agency at that point, is by us choosing to submit ourselves to certain standards of living, so that then it's not imposed on us in greater force by a federal government or a state government.
Yeah, that's a great point to talk about, that we in the state of agency are allowed to be lawgivers in a sense. And the most important place for us to start is in our own lives, to say, do I follow the principles and laws or rules that are good, or that are appropriate, or that are just, or that are based in agency or liberty? To me, the balance point of agency is the same balance point of liberty. The two go hand in hand. That we have this ability to we have the ability to choose. And when people talk about liberty or agency, to me, we're only talking about the difference. We're only talking, the terms are used differently, whether it's politics or whether it's religion. But to me, they're very much the same. And so with this notion, I just want to show this here. This state of liberty, or you could say agency right here. Laws are necessary to create some level of order, and they do come from a higher power. All law to be effective has to come from a higher power. I can't enforce the law of gravity myself, and I can't enforce laws of the land myself. There has to be a government that exists for that. But if I go too far, if the laws go too far from these external forces, then it really starts to get us towards tyranny, and this is what breaks down life as well. Any deviation from this point here is a deviation from life itself, and life will suffer, internally will suffer. Here on this side, laws do hurt, but the private solutions that you're talking about, Michael, the morality, this is where they govern. Morality has to exist on this right side of the scale to avoid tyranny. And you're very correct that if we don't do it ourselves, if we don't self-impose this morality, that the laws will then start to creep in. We'll cede that power to the government. And this is something, as I've talked with people, where sometimes people get depressed and they say, well, I can't stop anyone else from being immoral or unjust. And so it just must be doomed. Liberty is a state that can't exist. And I actually strongly believe that if we exercise our agency and we teach and we're proactive about teaching people about morality and why morality is a good thing and why they should live by it, that many people will choose to adopt it. And I believe that specifically because they're alive. They get to experience the result of not having morality. It starts to eat away at you. It has a negative, there's a consequence to it when we don't live by morality. And we experience that. And I believe very strongly that when we talk about truth, people, for the most part, will choose to live and abide by it. From the war in heaven, going back to it, says that Satan was able to convince a third of the hosts of heaven, or a third part of the hosts of heaven, to follow him. If this was 1/3, then there'd still be 2/3 that chose to follow truth. More still chose to follow truth. And I believe very strongly that that will still continue to work out that way. We believe in our religion that there's a premortal life that we were a part of, that we made the decision prior to coming to this earth to be part of the 2/3 that chose to pursue life, that chose to pursue this existence. And we chose to accept the conditions and confines of law because it also became the foundation that enabled us to progress, to become, to pursue, because there was something that absolutely existed that would be granted if we did what we're supposed to do. And so there is a scripture that we talk about often in our religion that says, the scripture says, I, the Lord, am bound when you do what I say, but when you do not what I say, you have no promise. And to us, that's described this fact that God treats all of his words spoken as law. He lives by them. And so if he says, hey, Austin, if you go to church and you do these different things, you'll end up with this, and I do those things, then I can lay claim to that. It's predictable. It's an outcome. God is just, meaning he follows all law. Now we'll get more into the fact that we break laws, we sin, we have problems, we suffer consequences. And that's where an atonement needs to come in. And that's where Jesus Christ comes in to this scene. But from our perspective, as looking at life itself, looking at the war in heaven, the battle, Satan ultimately didn't like the conditions of life. Life required that I choose. And if I choose, I might choose wrong. I might hurt someone. I might do something I shouldn't do, and I would suffer the consequences for it. This means that life and pain became fundamentally connected. And anyone who feared pain more than they loved life would have been very terrified of a plan that gave life with pain involved. And it's fascinating to look at our existence here, to look at even childbirth. It's a painful thing from others. There's a lot of pain in bringing life to others and to go through that process. And to me, it's a recognition or a reminder that life does have hardship, life does have some suffering. But those are the things, the fact they exist, are what then says, well, life exists, something better exists, something good exists too. If you've experienced pain, it can make you depressed, or it can give you hope that there's actually something opposite it. Because in our existence, we have an opposite to everything. And when we experience those things, we can know there's something better. And we'll get more into that and talk more in depth about how some of those relate and correlate. But ultimately, the point of today's discussion is to really highlight this notion that law brings life. Law creates boundaries. It creates identity. It creates it so it makes us there can be a planet, a human form and bounds to things because the elements don't cross those. And they respect the laws that are created. And now that I have a body, my body's conscious, it can move, it can do things. It gives me the ability to choose. And that ability only comes due to the existence of law. And then my choices, my agency exist in large part because of morality and me choosing to do what's right, even if there's no external force compelling it at that moment.
And a lot of that I think you can see in the political climate today. You hinted at a little bit. There's a lot of people have a large vested interest, especially at the federal level, in what's going on with the president of the United States. And both sides are claiming the other side is a threat to our way of life, right? And we talk about how laws can create life, and then as we talk about the imposition or the removal of laws, so they can take away life as well. And I think a lot of people feel that if things don't go the way they would like, with a president being elected, with the government making certain laws, that their life, their way of life will be affected, that it will change significantly, and that is a scary thing. And I think that's why there's a vested interest in that. But I think the problem we have is we've put our priorities in, sometimes when we talk about the president of the United States, in one individual. We've said all of our hope in life rests in a single individual. And if that individual is a person, I don't care if they're a good person or terrible person, then it's kind of a failure at that point. People are prone to make mistakes. And so we've put all of this interest in a person to fix, to make it so we can continue to have our agency, to have our way of life as we understand it. But that's a flawed theory when it's vested in another person, unless it's vested in a perfect individual like Jesus Christ. And so we need to look back to ourselves and ask, what are the laws that we've abandoned as individuals? How did we get to the point where we have vested all of our future hopes in a single person who will lead our country. It should be a clear indicator that we have placed the battle not in our hands, where we're supposed to be fighting for our own agency, but in the hands of another person who will make mistakes. And so that law that could, add life or take away life, we're vesting all of that in a single power in this country, instead of saying, what are we doing as individuals? What are we doing in our communities? What are those laws that we have decided we don't want the responsibility for? We've given up responsibility of those to state governments, to federal governments, instead of saying, what can we do in our communities to make this work? It will correct that balance if we can do that. And then the office of President of the United States becomes back to the point where it's important, but it's not going to change life. It's not life or death, as we have been trying to make it out to be, particularly in this election cycle. We need to look back to ourselves and say, what are we doing so that we're not giving all that power to a certain place? How do we retain, and what laws do we need to follow in our own lives to make sure that we have control over our own agency?
Yeah, and that's a great point. It goes directly to a letter that Governor Cox from Utah wrote just this last little bit. Governor Cox said specifically, he wrote a letter to Trump. So a little background, Trump had the assassination attempt. And after that, Governor Cox from Utah, in the week that Trump's assassination attempt took place, prior to the assassination attempt, Cox had confirmed he wasn't going to vote for or endorse Trump. He had not been a supporter of Trump. And after the assassination attempt, a few days later, he writes this letter to President Trump. And he says in the letter a lot of things. But one of them was, he said, President Trump, I've come to the opinion that you're the only person that can save this country. And I looked at that and I just thought, I don't care how you feel about Trump or don't feel about Trump. The fact that my governor in my state believes that there's one person that can make or break America is really concerning to me. Because to your point, Michael, America is this land that's incredibly resilient because it's made up of millions of people that get to make choices and decisions. We haven't lost that. No matter what President Trump does or doesn't do, we all have our agency still to make choices, and the country is not in his hands. He doesn't just have this army of drones that do whatever he commands. We're all human. We all have agency. And sure, there's some angry people, but there's a lot of really good, good-tempered, well-mannered people as well. And we still get to make decisions. We still get to do things. That's the genius of America, is that America's power is not in one person's hand. It's kind of like saying, oh, one person holds the keys to, this planet Earth or to the universe. Talking about from the human perspective, we say, no, that's not how this works. There's laws in place. And if we, as a people, live by the moral code that we're supposed to, and we as a people push to uphold the laws of the land, there's no one person that has the power to make or break America. It's a very simple formula. It's a very simple formula of life itself, of agency. Yes, someone can technically shoot me. They can take away my life, my physical life for a time, but they can't destroy my spiritual life. And the world we live in is a fallen world. So it produces slightly different results in some scenarios than a non-fallen world would. One of those is this physical death that we experience. But even then, I still have this choice of agency. Do I fall in line with what one person's telling me to do, or do I not? And I believe very strongly that we need to be actively saying to people, look, no one person has the power to make or break things. You still decide things. It's still up to you. I often think about, well, what would have happened if more people in the Nazi regime had just stood up? Maybe they would have been killed. But if enough had stood up and said no, even I don't even think it would have taken a ton of them. I do believe that there could have been different results and different things. The Hitler regime did not happen because Hitler had all the power. It happened because people chose to go along with it. There were choices all along the way with the evil that took place. And something like the Revolutionary War is amazing because there were choices all along the way that helped earn us our freedom. And we've seen other examples where choices all along the way do atrocious things. But there's no one person making all those choices. Humans choose. And we as individuals in our political climate today, we need to have the faith to do the right thing. It's as simple as that. We don't need to be full of hate, full of anger. We don't have to just sit by and go, oh, just do whatever you want. No, we can say there are laws, there are principles. We're going to stand for what we believe is good, but we're going to do it in a way that respects morality, that does these things, because every single one of us is a powerful force. That's what liberty and life itself gives, is that if you stand up and say, no, it's not right, that is a force that acts on everything else. And they may choose still to kill you or do whatever they want to with you, mock you, whatever else, but they still have to try and deal with you. And every time that interaction takes place that someone says, no, that's not right, it's proof that no one person has the power to do everything. No matter how close the world gets to tyranny, they'll never fully achieve it because the laws of this earth cannot override the laws of life and agency. We can still choose to do things. And our choices will make a difference. Every time we say no to what's wrong, every time we say yes to what's right, it makes a difference. All of us have a sphere of influence. We all impact that, and nothing happens in a vacuum. These things all go hand in hand. And so I say very strongly to the letter that Governor Cox wrote, it's a complete lie. Trump is not the person that will make or break this country. That's our choices. We each get to choose how we respond, what we do. Whether or not he's president, we still get to choose. Life still goes on. And we have to look at ourselves and say, what do I need to change in my life? And so, Michael, you had mentioned that. And I wanted to give a couple of concrete examples as we're talking here to say, what is it that I as an individual need to make sure I'm doing in my life? So one is, am I living honestly? Am I being true to what I tell other people, my commitments? Am I honest with my employer? Am I honest with my spouse? Am I honest with my kids? Honesty is absolutely essential to having a strong sense of agency and liberty. If we can't be honest, we will lose agency and liberty. And I believe that many of us justify taking things from others in different ways. Not working when we're on the clock is a form of dishonesty. It's taking from someone. We didn't exchange labor for it. We just clocked in and sat there. These types of things impact us. Another one I believe very strongly in is staying true from a sexual perspective to keeping that within marriage and staying true to a spouse. If we as humans embrace the notion that sexuality is everywhere and that it's with everyone, do whatever you want, all these different types of things, there's no bounds to it. It destroys us as a nation. And we have to be circumspect. And the scriptures refer to it as our passions. We have to put boundaries around those ourselves and live by that to achieve a state of liberty and a state of happiness. I believe very strongly that Satan knows that sexuality itself can destroy agency and liberty. It makes all things become a pound in one, just everything starts to blend together. And we see that taking place with transgenderism and homosexuality and all these things, pansexuality, whatever's taking place. People are just now becoming, everything, animals, whatever. And that will continue to increase. And it will continue to destroy liberty and life itself because it's removing choice. Once everything is there, then there's nothing. Those are two things. The third one I would say is that we need to stop asking the government to solve all our problems, and we have to take personal responsibility for our own lives. It's our responsibility to get out of debt. It's not the government's responsibility to pay off our debts. It's our responsibility to prepare for a rainy day, to prepare for job loss. It's our responsibility to be kind to our neighbors, to talk, to have a community, to associate with people. We have responsibilities to those around us, even caring for the poor and needy. That's our responsibility. It's not the government's responsibility. The government is there to create certain laws. But we as a people have to take on the responsibility to care for the poor and needy. And it's fascinating reading the scriptures in the Book of Mormon. Again, there's a passage that says that if you neglect the poor and needy, then you won't retain a remission of your sins, meaning you'll be in a state of condemnation. You'll be in a state of death per se, because you're not fulfilling your personal responsibility to those around you. We each have a responsibility to those around us. And while I don't have the ability to care for every single poor person on the planet, I do have the ability to help at least one of them to do something. And I need to take that responsibility and live it. And so those are some, at least three things: honesty, I'd say sexual boundaries, appropriateness, keeping it within marriage, and also personal responsibility for our lives and our things are three major personal moral codes that we need to live by. There's others as well, and Michael might chime in on some of them if he wants to, but these are areas where when you think, well, what can I do to preserve liberty? You need to live by those principles. Those three will contribute incredibly to the expansion of the state, the government, contribute incredibly towards encroachment towards tyranny more and more. And we as a people have to say, no, it's up to me to be honest. It's up to me to not require someone to sue me. I can make it right if I do something wrong. I can take responsibility. I can act morally and treat other people as humans, not as sexual objects. We have to see humans as humans in order for liberty to exist. And these are just, again, some of the things that go along with this, but super critical to our preservation and our country's preservation and liberty, and very strongly disagree with any notion that one person can make or break us. It's part of this fallen world. We have the choice. And that's one of the fundamental aspects of the war in heaven, is that when we have the choice, we have the power, we have the responsibility to do something, to be a part of something, to contribute to something. And when we do, that brings life from an eternal perspective. When we don't, it brings death. We start to suffer the consequences of those things. Michael, do you have any thoughts or follow up on any of those things?
I think those are really good principles. I wouldn't want to add to them at this point in time. I would offer the caution that as we consider those principles, to be careful in how we justify our actions. We are, me in particular, I see it in myself all the time. I'm very good at justifying any deviation I have in those principles. To say, well, it isn't going to matter, or this isn't going to hurt anybody, or it doesn't matter if I'm that honest in this respect. Everybody else is doing the same thing, so what's it going to make a difference if I do it? It's really easy to justify, but you have to, be your own worst critic, I guess, at that point, and to say, how can I do better? I see a lot where people expect others to live principles in a certain way that they refuse to do so themselves. They don't see the principle applying to them in the same way. Without trying to be too overly critical, I do hear a lot of people talk about how they don't like the way the government hands out money to individuals. But in 2020, 2021, during the COVID pandemic, the government offered bailout funds to lots of people. And there were, everybody in the country was receiving money, and not everybody needed money from the perspective. The federal government said this is for people who can't work, but it didn't, turn out that way. Everybody just got money, and everybody had the opportunity to say no thanks and send it back. It's just not something that really happened. And people who are upset about handouts to other people took it and said, well, I could use this, even if they did something responsible with it, like paying off more of their debt. Or many people did something, just bought something they thought was fun. But I think the point there is, how are we justifying our own behavior? What is, to use the word integrity, what are we saying to ourselves? Should we say we need to live the way that we expect other people to live, even if that means that we are disadvantaged to a certain degree? Our goal in this country seems to be, in the modern world, really, seems to be the pursuit of convenience and advantage. Does it give me a monetary advantage? Is it more convenient? Then I'm going to do it. Does it cost me more? Then I'm not going to do it. Instead of saying, is this the right thing to do? Is this the law that we would like to live by? We just justify it via convenience or advantage. And I think that it will cost us individually to retain freedom. We know that it costs people their lives initially for freedom. There is a cost to freedom, and we acknowledge the loss of life. But I don't think we acknowledge perhaps the loss of opportunity, monetarily speaking, or some sort of advantage. It may cost us more to retain our liberty, but it's a cost we should be willing to pay. We need to look into ourselves and ask how we're justifying our behavior and say, this may cost me a little bit more. I may lose an advantage to my neighbor or my rival company, but I'm going to make this policy decision or this life decision because I believe that it will continue to preserve liberty, it will preserve agency. And if we just base everything off of convenience and advantage, our liberty can be bought, and it will be bought out from underneath us, and we'll lose it. And so I think in the pursuit of those principles you discussed, we just need to be very cautious in how we justify our behavior and how we decide what decisions we'll make, I guess.
Yeah, and I love that point. I think it's a great one to end on. I have a little quote to share with it, that if we base our decisions on what's right or wrong based on our pocketbook, then our liberties can be bought. And I want to reiterate that when I listen to people debate about the president and which president's better, they go to talking about the economy. They say, well, under this president, the economy was this, or under this president, the economy was this. And somehow we've assigned all economic success to the president, even though a lot of the things the president does don't make or break the economy. There's a lot of other factors going on. But even then, I get highly concerned when people say, well, the economy was better under this president, so I'm going to vote for this one. I say, well, what principles, what truths are you living by? I say, well, someone openly told me, he said, I don't really know what to vote on principle wise. He says, so I just vote on my pocketbook. And when we make votes that way, then our liberties can be bought. We get upset. I see conservatives get upset at things like student loan forgiveness. They say, oh, the left is just buying votes. Well, why isn't the right just buying votes when they pass things in like Utah did with saying that they'll give homeschoolers and private schoolers $8,000 a year per kid? It's a buying of a vote. Makes someone richer, makes them have more things in this world. And our liberties should not be for sale. The underlying factor in whether something's right or wrong shouldn't be what it does to our pocketbook. It should be, well, is it right or wrong? Because if it's wrong and it increases our pocketbook, that's a momentary benefit. It's kind of like you go out and commit adultery. There might be one night where you think life's great, but then you have to deal with the fallout of that for the rest of your existence. And these are pieces that just because something feels good in the moment doesn't mean it's right. And just because it increases our pocketbook in the moment doesn't mean it's right. And so I like your point about being careful how we rationalize things about what's right or wrong. And this is a quote that Ezra Taft Benson shared. He was a prophet but also a government leader. He served in the cabinet, federal cabinet. But he's talking about standing up for liberty. And his quote says, "It might hurt your business or your family," says the devil. "And besides, why not let the Gentiles save the country? They aren't as busy as you are." Well, he's talking specifically now about the money side. There were many businessmen who went along with Hitler because it supposedly helped their business. They lost everything. Many of us are here today because our forefathers loved truth enough that they fought at Valley Forge or across the plains in spite of the price it cost them or their families. We had better take our small pain now than our greater loss later. There were souls who wished afterwards that they had stood and fought with Washington and the founding fathers, but they waited too long. They passed up eternal glory. There has never been a greater time than now to stand up against entrenched evil. And while the Gentiles established the Constitution, we have a divine mandate to preserve it. He's talking specifically about those in the church, out of the church. But to me, this is a deeper principle to say those of us that know, we have a divine mandate to preserve the Constitution. The Constitution is the basis of liberty in our country. But the point of this is that we need to pass up a small pain now, even if it means a little loss of money, if it's the right thing. We can't vote based on our pocketbook and expect to maintain liberty. We have to know our principles. We have to know what's at battle, because the world's rich enough right now. The government's rich enough. It can print money all at once that they can buy your freedoms from you if your freedoms are for sale. And if you are justifying your actions based on what makes you more money, your freedoms are for sale. And we have to make sure to take a stand and say, yep, might hurt some today, but it's worth the cost later. And that's one of the principles of the law of life, of choice, is that we have bounds that we operate within. Money has its bounds. We have our bounds. Liberty is a state that we choose to opt into or opt out of. And the decisions we make on the personal moral code side are us choosing to opt in or opt out. And those influence other people around us, because life is of such a nature that my actions influence those around me, which influences those around them. It spreads. And our actions absolutely impact others. That's just the basis of life itself. So the invitation is to really stop and take stock of your life and ask yourself, are you living true to the principles that you know are right? If you're not, what do you need to do to change? What do you need to do to get true to those principles? And do the principles that you know are right, do you have an understanding of liberty, of law, of these connections? If not, then start to learn it. Start to come to an appreciation of these principles, because these principles aren't being openly taught in our schools. It's not part of our curriculum. We love to teach math. We love to teach English. We love to teach science. But we're not teaching a healthy respect for the deep moral code that should exist in us, that we should abide by to maintain our liberties and preserve the state of happiness that can be ours if we choose to opt into that. So thanks for joining us today. We appreciate your time, and we look forward to talking with you more next week about more of the aspects of the war in heaven and how it plays out in our life here on this earth.